A young monk once asked his teacher a simple question: "How do I find peace?" The old man didn't answer. He picked up a cup, filled it with tea, until it overflowed onto the table, onto the floor, onto the monk's hands. The monk jumped back and cried out. The teacher finally spoke. "Your mind is this cup, already full. There is no room for anything I could give you." That story is centuries old, but if you're watching this tonight, chances are your cup is overflowing too. Not with tea, with tabs open in your head that never close. With conversations you're still replaying. With a to-do list that multiplies the second you finish one thing. Tonight, we're not adding more to that cup. We're going to sit with 20 short stories. Old ones, quiet ones, the kind that were never meant to be read fast. They were meant to be walked through, slowly, like a path through unfamiliar terrain, where you don't know what's around the bend, but you trust your feet anyway. Here's what most people get wrong about peace. They think it's a destination, somewhere you arrive after enough success, enough money, enough control. So they keep walking faster, thinking the finish line is just a little further. But peace was never at the end of the path. It was the way you were supposed to be walking the whole time, and almost nobody was told that. If you've ever felt like you're doing everything right and still feel lost, this is for you. If your mind runs the same 3 worries on a loop every night before sleep, this is for you. Let's walk through this path together, one story, one step at a time. The cup that was already full. We started with this image for a reason. Before you can receive anything, you have to notice what you're already carrying. Most people walk through life, certain they're open-minded, ready to learn, ready to grow. But underneath, they're gripping tightly to opinions about how things should be, how people should treat them, how their life should have turned out by now. Picture a traveler standing at the base of an unfamiliar mountain. He's got a backpack stuffed with maps of other mountains he's climbed before. He keeps trying to match this new terrain to an old map. It never fits. He gets frustrated, exhausted, lost. The mountain hasn't changed. His grip on the old map has. This is the first layer of the teaching. Peace doesn't get added to a full life. It gets revealed once you're willing to set some things down. Not everything, just the grip. Let's slow down here, because this is where most people nod along and keep walking without actually feeling the weight of what's being said. Think about the last time someone gave you advice you didn't ask for. Maybe a parent, maybe a friend, maybe even a stranger on the internet. What happened in your chest the second they opened their mouth? For most of us, something tightens before a single word lands. We're already building the rebuttal. We're already deciding they don't understand our situation. That tightening, that instant defense, that's the cup. It was full long before they spoke. Now think about how often that happens in a single day. Someone questions a decision you made, and instead of sitting with the question, you explain yourself twice as hard. Someone offers a different way of doing something at work, and instead of trying it, you list every reason your way is better. None of this makes you a bad person. It makes you human. But it also means the cup rarely gets the chance to empty, even for a moment, even long enough to notice there might be room for something new. Here's the strange part. Most people think the goal is to become someone who agrees with everything, who has no opinions, who lets every idea in without question. That's not what this story is pointing toward. The traveler at the base of the mountain isn't being told to throw away every map he's ever made. He's being told to notice he's holding one, and to ask whether it actually matches the ground beneath his feet right now. That's a completely different thing than having no opinions at all. It's the difference between a closed fist and an open hand that still knows how to hold something. Think about the opinions you carry about your own life, the idea that you should be further along by now, The idea that a certain kind of relationship is the only kind worth having. The idea that rest has to be earned before it can be allowed. These aren't neutral facts about the universe. They're maps, drawn a long time ago, maybe by a parent, maybe by a culture, maybe by a version of yourself that was scared and trying to make sense of things the only way it knew how. And like any map, they were useful once, for some mountain, at some point. But you're not on that mountain anymore. You're on this one, right now, and the ground doesn't care what the old paper says. This is why the tea overflowing onto the table matters so much as an image. It's not gentle. It's not a soft metaphor about being a little too busy. It's tea spilling onto the monk's hands, hot enough to make him flinch, hot enough to make him pull back and actually notice what was happening, instead of politely ignoring it. Most of us need something that direct, before we notice our own cup is full. A relationship that keeps hitting the same wall, no matter who we're with. A job we keep losing interest in no matter how many times we change companies. A pattern of anxious nights that doesn't care how many new habits we try to bolt onto our routine. These are the spills. They're not punishments. They're information. They're the tea landing on our hands, trying to get our attention long before we're willing to give it. Now here's where the traveler and the mountain become useful again. Imagine he finally stops. He sits down at the base of this unfamiliar mountain, exhausted, frustrated that nothing about this climb is matching what he expected, and instead of pulling out yet another old map, he does something almost embarrassingly simple. He looks up. He actually looks at the mountain in front of him. Not the one in his memory, not the one on the paper, but the one that's actually there, with its own ridges, its own weather, its own particular danger and particular beauty. That's it. That's the whole shift. Not throwing the backpack away, just setting it down long enough to see clearly. This is harder than it sounds, because most of us have built a kind of identity around our maps. If someone questions the belief that you have to struggle to earn rest, you might feel like they're questioning your worth, not just an idea you picked up somewhere along the way. If someone shows you a calmer way to handle conflict, and it works better than your old way, there can be a strange grief in that, a mourning for all the years you fought so hard, using an approach that wasn't serving you. Letting go of an old map isn't just an intellectual exercise. It can feel like losing a piece of who you thought you were. But here's the quiet relief hidden inside all of this. You were never actually the map. You were always the one holding it. Which means you can set one down and still be completely, fully yourself, standing there, present, capable of picking up a better way of seeing things, because your hands were never permanently fused to the old paper in the first place. That's not a loss. That's the exact freedom the story is pointing toward. So the next time you feel that tightening in your chest, that instinct to defend, to explain, to prove your version is the only correct one, try something small. Don't force yourself to agree with whatever's in front of you. Just pause long enough to notice the grip. Notice you're holding something. Ask yourself, gently, not harshly, whether this particular map was drawn for this particular mountain, or whether it's simply the one you happen to be used to carrying. Sometimes the answer will be that your way really is right for this moment, and that's fine too. The point was never to abandon every instinct you have. The point was to actually look, instead of reacting on autopilot from an old, worn piece of paper you stopped checking against reality a long time ago. This is the layer beneath everything else we're about to walk through tonight. Every story that follows, every teaching about running from shadows or empty boats drifting across still water, depends on this first understanding. You cannot receive new insight into a cup that's already full to the brim with old certainty. You cannot see a new mountain clearly while comparing it constantly to the last one you climbed. Setting down the grip, even for a few minutes, even just enough to breathe, is what makes every following story actually land, instead of bouncing off the surface of a mind too busy defending itself to listen. And maybe that's the real invitation hiding inside this first story. Not a demand to change everything about how you see the world tonight. Just a small, honest question to sit with as we move forward together. What map are you still holding on to, out of habit, out of comfort, out of fear of what it might mean to set it down? You don't have to answer it fully right now. Just notice it's there. That noticing, that small crack of space between you and the old certainty, is exactly where everything else we're about to explore tonight is finally going to have room to land. There's another layer to this worth walking through slowly, because the traveler's backpack isn't only full of maps he drew himself. Some of those maps were handed to him. A parent who was afraid of failure might have drawn a map that says, "Ambition is dangerous," that wanting too much invites disappointment. A culture obsessed with productivity might have drawn a map that says your worth is measured only by output, that stillness is laziness in disguise. He didn't choose these maps consciously. He inherited them the way a traveler inherits the weather of the region he was born in, without ever being asked if he agreed with the forecast. This matters because it changes how we should relate to the grip we've been talking about. It's easy to feel a flash of shame the moment you notice you're clutching an old, outdated belief, as if you should have known better, as if holding on to it this long makes you foolish. But most of these maps were never chosen freely in the first place. They were absorbed quietly, over years, through the people who raised us, the rooms we grew up in, the quiet lessons we picked up simply by watching what got rewarded and what got punished. Noticing the grip isn't a moment for self-criticism. It's a moment for gentle curiosity, the same curiosity the traveler needs when he finally looks up at the actual mountain instead of the paper in his hands. Consider how this plays out in something as ordinary as the way you handle rest. Maybe somewhere along the way you absorbed a quiet rule that rest has to be earned, that stopping before the to-do list is finished is a small betrayal of who you're supposed to be. You didn't sit down one day and decide this was true. It was handed to you, folded up small, tucked into the backpack, before you were even old enough to question what was being placed there. And now, decades later, you find yourself unable to sit still on a Sunday afternoon without a low hum of guilt in the background, even when there's genuinely nothing urgent waiting for you. This is exactly the kind of map the story is asking you to notice. Not to burn it dramatically, not to swing wildly to the opposite extreme and abandon all responsibility, but simply to hold it up next to the mountain you're actually standing on and ask whether it still fits. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe the season of your life you're in right now genuinely calls for rest, for slowness, for a kind of stillness that an old map, drawn for a completely different terrain, never accounted for. There's a reason the teacher in the original story didn't simply explain this to the young monk in words. Explaining rarely reaches the place where these old maps are stored. Words bounce off a full cup, the same way advice bounces off someone defending an old belief. The tea had to actually spill, hot and undeniable, before the lesson could land anywhere real. This tells us something important about how change actually happens for most of us too. It's rarely a lecture that shifts an old pattern. It's usually a moment, sometimes an uncomfortable one, that makes the old map impossible to ignore any longer. Maybe that moment for you was a diagnosis that made productivity suddenly feel meaningless compared to time with people you love. Maybe it was a relationship ending that made you question every rule you'd built about what love was supposed to look like. Maybe it's simply this exact moment, watching this video, feeling some quiet tug of recognition about a grip you didn't fully realize you were holding until it was named out loud. Whatever the moment is, the invitation stays the same. Not to reject everything you've ever believed, but to keep enough openness that when the tea spills, you're willing to actually look down and notice, instead of simply wiping your hands and reaching for the same cup, the same map, the same grip, all over again. The man who chased his shadow. There's an old tale about a man terrified of his own shadow and his own footsteps. He decided the only solution was to run from them. So he ran and ran. The faster he moved, the faster his shadow moved with him. His footsteps never fell behind. He ran until his heart gave out, right there on the path, never once realizing that if he'd simply stopped and stood still in the shade of a tree, both would have vanished on their own. We laugh at this man because his solution seems so obviously wrong. But look closer at your own week. How many hours have you spent running from a feeling instead of standing still long enough to let it pass through you? Scrolling to outrun boredom, working late to outrun a fear you haven't named, filling silence with noise to outrun a thought you don't want to hear. The terrain doesn't ask you to run faster. It asks you to find the shade. Let's actually picture this man for a moment, because the story moves so fast that it's easy to miss how strange his logic really is. He looks down. He sees his shadow, stretched long across the ground beside him. He looks behind. He sees his own footsteps trailing off into the distance, and something in him decides these are threats, not neutral facts about being a person who exists in daylight and walks on solid ground, but actual dangers to be escaped. So he does the only thing that makes sense to a mind convinced it's under attack. He runs. Here's the part that should stop us cold. The faster he runs, the more shadow he creates, because he's moving faster under the same sun. The harder his feet strike the ground, the more footprints pile up behind him. His own solution is manufacturing more of the exact thing he's trying to escape. This isn't bad luck. It's the direct, mathematical result of trying to outrun something that was never actually separate from him in the first place. Now think about your own version of this. Maybe it's not a shadow. Maybe it's a memory of something you said in an argument 3 years ago that still visits you at 2 in the morning. Maybe it's a fear about money, or about being alone, or about not being good enough that shows up quietly, and instead of sitting with it for even 30 seconds, you reach for your phone, open an app, scroll until your thumb goes numb, close it, open a different one. That's running. That's the exact same motion as this man sprinting down a dusty road, except our road is a bright rectangle in our palm, and our shadow is a feeling instead of a shape on the ground. Think about how much of modern life is built entirely around this kind of running. Notifications exist to interrupt discomfort the second it starts to surface. Entire industries are built on giving you somewhere else to put your attention the instant something uncomfortable rises in your chest. And it works. For about 4 seconds, the exact length of time it takes to swipe to the next video or the next message. Then the discomfort is still there, waiting, patient, because it was never actually chasing you. It was simply present, the same way a shadow is simply present under the sun. It only looked like it was chasing him because he was the one moving. This is worth sitting with honestly, without judgment, because almost everyone does this in some form. Grief that gets buried under busyness, because stillness feels unbearable. Anger that gets swallowed and redirected into working extra hours, because facing the person who caused it feels too frightening. Loneliness that gets papered over with constant company, because even one evening alone with your own thoughts feels like standing too close to a cliff edge. None of this makes you weak. It makes you a person who was never taught that stillness is actually safer than running, that the discomfort you're avoiding is far less dangerous than the exhaustion of avoiding it forever. Now let's go back to the tree in the story, because this is the part that gets skipped over too quickly. The solution offered isn't complicated. It isn't even effortful. He doesn't need a new technique, a new philosophy, a new set of rules to follow. He needs to stop. Just stop. Stand still. Let the shade of a single tree do what running never could, because shadows don't exist without light hitting an object. Step into shade, and the shadow that was chasing him has nothing left to attach itself to. It's not that the shadow gets defeated, it's that the entire premise of the chase dissolves the moment he's no longer feeding it with motion. This is exactly what happens with the discomfort we spend so much energy running from. Fear doesn't need to be defeated in some dramatic showdown. It needs somewhere to land, briefly, without being fed by more avoidance. Sit with the fear about money for 2 full minutes, without reaching for a distraction, and something strange happens. It doesn't vanish, not immediately, but it stops swelling. It stops chasing. It becomes something you're simply standing next to, instead of something sprinting after you down an endless road. Try this the next time you feel that familiar urge rising, the one that makes your hand twitch toward your phone, or your mind reach for a task to bury yourself in. Instead of running immediately, ask yourself one small question. What am I actually feeling right now, underneath the urge to escape it? Not the story about it, not the analysis of why you feel it, just the raw sensation, a tightness in the chest, a heaviness behind the eyes, a restless static in the hands. Naming it, simply, honestly, without judgment, is the equivalent of stepping into the shade. You're not fighting the shadow, you're removing the light that was casting it in the first place, which in this case is the constant motion of avoidance. Of course, this isn't a permanent fix applied once and never needed again. The man in the story presumably has to relearn this lesson more than once, because old habits of running don't disappear after a single afternoon under a tree. The same will be true for you. There will be nights the phone wins. There will be days the busyness wins. This isn't about achieving some flawless state of never running again. It's about remembering, more and more often, that the shade exists, that stillness is available, that the shadow chasing you was never actually chasing you at all. There's something almost tender about this story once you sit with it long enough. The man wasn't a fool for being afraid. He was a person doing his best with an understanding that was incomplete. He genuinely believed running was the only option available to him, because no one had ever shown him the alternative. That's true for most of us too. Nobody sits a child down and explains that stillness is often more effective than motion when something uncomfortable arrives. We learn to run, to distract, to fill, to escape, because that's what was modeled for us, again and again, until it became instinct. Think about the adults who raised you, and the adults who raised them. How many of them knew how to sit with discomfort without immediately reaching for something to numb it? Some turned to work, disappearing into long hours because an empty evening felt unbearable. Some turned to substances, to constant background noise, to always having somewhere else to be. None of this was necessarily talked about openly. It was simply demonstrated, over and over, in the small, quiet choices made in front of us, before we were old enough to notice we were learning anything at all. We picked up the running, the same way we picked up the way we hold a fork, without instruction, simply by watching closely enough, for long enough. This is worth naming clearly, because it removes a layer of shame that tends to attach itself to this particular struggle. If you find yourself constantly reaching for distraction, the moment something uncomfortable rises, that's not a personal failing carved into your character. It's a strategy you learned a long time ago, from people who were themselves running from something they never learned how to sit with either. Naming this doesn't excuse the pattern from ever needing to change. But it does mean you can approach the change with far more patience than most people give themselves. The same patience you'd offer a child who was simply taught the wrong lesson through no fault of their own. There's a practical shape this can take in an ordinary day. Picture the exact moment you feel the pull toward your phone after receiving a difficult message, or the moment you feel the urge to start yet another task the second a quiet evening opens up in front of you. That pull is the running. It happens fast, almost automatically, faster than conscious thought most of the time. The practice isn't about willing yourself never to feel that pull. It's about building a half-second gap between the pull and the action. Just enough space to ask what you're actually running from underneath the urge to move. Sometimes that gap reveals something surprisingly small. A flicker of boredom, easily tolerated once you actually look at it directly instead of fleeing from its shadow. Other times, it reveals something larger, a grief you haven't fully let yourself feel, a fear about the future you've been outrunning for months. Either way, the gap itself is where the shade lives. You don't need a forest. You don't need hours of stillness. You don't need a retreat in the mountains to practice this. You need a few seconds, repeated often enough, where you choose to stand still instead of run, right there in the middle of an ordinary afternoon. But instinct can be retaught. Every time you choose the tree over the road, even for 30 seconds, even imperfectly, you're proving to yourself that the shade actually works, that the shadow really does disappear when you stop feeding it with motion. And slowly, over time, that becomes the new instinct. Not running from what shows up inside you, but finding the nearest patch of shade and simply, quietly, letting it be. There's a certain kind of relief available here that running can never provide, no matter how far or how fast you go. Running always requires more running. One distraction leads to the need for the next, because the underlying discomfort was never actually addressed, only postponed. Standing still, by contrast, only has to be done once for the shadow attached to that particular moment to dissolve completely. It's not a bigger effort. It's actually a smaller one, disguised for years as the harder path, simply because it feels so unfamiliar the first several times you try it. The farmer who said, "We'll see." A farmer's horse ran away. His neighbors said, "What terrible luck." He said, "We'll see." Days later, the horse returned, bringing 3 wild horses with it. The neighbors said, "What wonderful luck." He said, "We'll see." His son, trying to tame one of the wild horses, fell and broke his leg. The neighbors said, "What terrible luck." He said, "We'll see." Soon after, the army came through the village, taking every able-bodied young man for a war most would never return from. Because of his broken leg, the son stayed home. This farmer wasn't detached or cold. He simply understood something about the path most of us fight against, with everything we have. We don't actually know, in the moment, something happens, whether it's the ending of the story or just one bend in a much longer road. The terrain keeps unfolding long after we've already decided what it means. Let's start with something honest. Most of us, hearing this farmer's response for the first time, feel a flicker of irritation. We want him to react. We want him to celebrate when the wild horses arrive and grieve when his son breaks a leg, because that's what feels human. That's what feels appropriate. His flat, steady, "We'll see," can almost sound like he doesn't care, like he's numb to the events of his own life. But that reading misses something essential about what he's actually doing. He's not refusing to feel. He's refusing to finish the story too early. Think about how quickly we do this in our own lives. A relationship ends, and we declare, immediately, in the rawest hour of that pain, that we'll never trust anyone again. That this proves something permanent and terrible about our worth. A job falls through, and we announce to ourselves, in that same breath, that we're not cut out for this field. That the door closing means the entire path was wrong. We take a single scene, one frame out of a film that's still being shot, and we write the ending onto it, as if the credits have already rolled. The horse running away is exactly this kind of scene. In the moment, it looks like pure loss. No horse, no help with the farm work, no obvious silver lining anywhere in sight. If the farmer had been like most of us, he would have spent those days convinced something had been taken from him permanently, grieving a closed door. But he didn't know yet, because nobody could know yet, that the very same event was quietly setting up something else entirely. The horse running away wasn't the end of anything. It was the opening scene of a much longer sequence that hadn't finished unfolding. This is where the story becomes less about horses and more about the layers of every difficult moment in your own life. Think back to something that felt devastating at the time, months or years ago. A relationship ending, a plan falling apart, a rejection that stung so badly you thought you'd never recover. Now look at where you are today. It's entirely possible, maybe even likely, that some part of your current life, a friendship, a skill, a strength you didn't know you had, exists specifically because that earlier door closed. Not because the universe has some grand plan waiting to reward you, but simply because closed doors redirect us onto paths we never would have found otherwise. Paths that sometimes turn out to hold something we couldn't have imagined asking for. None of this means you should force yourself into false positivity the moment something painful happens. That's not what the farmer does either. Notice, he never says, "This is actually good news," when the horse runs away. He doesn't pretend the wild horse's arriving is an unmixed blessing either, considering it's that very event that leads to his son's broken leg. He doesn't spin anything. He simply refuses to attach a final verdict to an unfinished sentence. "We'll see" isn't optimism, it's patience. It's the willingness to let the story keep being written before deciding what chapter you're in. This distinction matters enormously, because so much modern self-help culture pushes people toward forced positivity, toward immediately finding the silver lining, toward performing gratitude for pain before they've even had time to feel it honestly. That's not what this farmer is teaching. He's not skipping past the difficulty of a broken leg to arrive quickly at a lesson. His son is still in pain. The break still hurts, still requires care, still disrupts the rhythm of daily life on the farm. The farmer isn't denying any of that. He's simply not adding an extra layer of suffering on top of it, by insisting he already knows what this pain ultimately means for the larger story of his son's life. This is worth sitting with, because most of our suffering isn't actually caused by events themselves. It's caused by the story we immediately attach to those events. The horse ran away, and then we add layer upon layer of meaning onto it. This proves I'm unlucky. This proves nothing good stays in my life. This is a sign the whole season is cursed. None of these additions are facts. They're interpretations, offered at the fastest possible speed, by a mind desperate to make sense of an uncertain moment, by locking it into a story it can control. The farmer's discipline is refusing to add those layers prematurely. He lets the horse running away simply be what it is, an event, without immediately deciding what it means for the rest of his life. This isn't easy. It requires tolerating uncertainty, which is one of the hardest things a human mind is asked to do. We would almost rather have a bad story finished than a story with no ending yet, because at least a finished story, even a painful one, gives us something solid to stand on. "We'll see" asks us to stand on nothing solid at all, at least for a while, trusting that the ground will become clear later, in its own time. Think about how you might apply this the next time something goes wrong in your own life. Not by pretending you feel nothing, not by forcing gratitude you don't actually have yet, but simply by noticing the urge to finish the story too quickly and choosing instead to leave it open. The relationship ended, and instead of declaring you're unlovable forever, you might simply say, "We'll see." The job didn't work out, and instead of concluding you're not good enough for this field, you might simply say, "We'll see." Not as a magic phrase that erases the pain, but as an honest acknowledgement that you genuinely don't know yet what this chapter is setting up. There's a kind of quiet strength in this that has nothing to do with detachment or coldness. It actually requires more courage than reacting immediately, because it means sitting inside uncertainty without the relief of a finished narrative to grip onto. But it also protects you from a very specific kind of suffering, the suffering of grieving something that hasn't actually finished happening yet, of closing a door in your mind that the terrain itself hasn't finished opening or closing on its own. The farmer isn't wise because he predicted the war, or because he somehow knew the broken leg would save his son. He couldn't have known any of that. He's wise because he built a habit of not needing to know. That habit, repeated enough times, across enough difficult and confusing seasons, becomes something close to peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of no longer demanding certainty before you're willing to keep walking forward on the path. There's a reason this particular story has survived so many generations, retold in so many different forms, across so many different traditions. It touches something almost unbearable about being human, the fact that we are constantly asked to live forward through time while only being able to understand backward. In the moment the horse ran away, the farmer had no access to the future chapters of this story. He couldn't see the wild horses arriving, let alone the broken leg, or the army marching through. He was standing exactly where you and I stand, every single day, at the edge of an unwritten sentence, forced to respond to a present moment we can't yet see the full shape of. Most of us try to solve this unbearable uncertainty by pretending we can see further than we actually can. We declare verdicts quickly because uncertainty is uncomfortable, and a firm conclusion, even a painful one, feels more bearable than the open question. This is why breakups so often produce sweeping declarations, why job losses so often produce permanent conclusions about our worth, why a single difficult year can convince us that our entire life has taken a wrong turn. We're not being dramatic for the sake of it. We're doing what our minds do naturally when faced with something we can't yet make sense of. We rush to close the story because open stories are harder to carry. But look at what the farmer's patience actually protects him from. He never has to walk back a declaration. He never has to feel foolish for celebrating too early or grieving too permanently. He simply stays present with what's actually in front of him, doing what needs to be done, tending the wound, caring for his son, continuing the work of the farm, without adding the extra weight of a conclusion he wasn't yet equipped to draw. This isn't passivity. It's actually a form of discipline, choosing again and again not to reach for the false comfort of an early ending. Consider how this might apply to something happening in your life right now, something still unresolved, something you don't yet know the outcome of. Maybe it's a health concern still being investigated. Maybe it's a relationship going through a difficult stretch, uncertain whether it will strengthen or end. Maybe it's a career decision whose consequences won't be visible for years. The temptation in all of these situations is the same temptation the neighbors felt at every turn of the farmer's story, the urge to declare, right now, whether this is terrible luck or wonderful luck, before the story has finished being written. What would it look like to simply say, out loud or quietly to yourself, "We'll see," not as a dismissal of your feelings, not as an attempt to feel nothing, but as an honest admission that you are standing exactly where the farmer stood, at the edge of a sentence you cannot yet read the ending of. This phrase, small as it sounds, carries an enormous amount of relief inside it, because it releases you from the exhausting job of having to know everything right now, in this moment, before the terrain has even finished unfolding beneath your feet. There's also something worth noticing about the neighbors in this story, because most of us have played their role at some point too, watching someone else's life from the outside and offering quick verdicts about what their circumstances mean. It's easy to judge from a distance, to see only the horse running away and declare loudly what that must mean about someone's luck, their choices, their future. The farmer's response is a quiet correction, not just for himself, but for everyone standing around him. A reminder that none of us, watching from outside another person's unfinished story, actually know enough yet to hand down a verdict either. Perhaps the deepest gift of this story is the permission it gives you to stop performing certainty you don't actually have. You don't have to know right now whether this season of your life is a setback or a setup for something you can't yet see. You don't have to explain to anyone, including yourself, exactly what this chapter means before it's finished. You're allowed to simply keep walking, keep tending to what's in front of you, and let the rest of the sentence write itself in its own time. The empty boat. Imagine you're rowing a small boat across a still lake, early morning, alone. Out of nowhere, another boat crashes into yours. Fury rises instantly. You spin around, ready to shout at whoever was careless enough to hit you. But the boat is empty. No one steered it into you. It simply drifted. The anger you felt a second ago, where did it go? It had nowhere left to attach itself. That's the trick of this story. We spend so much energy being furious at the someone behind every collision in our lives. But so many collisions are simply empty boats, no malice behind them. Just the current, doing what current does. The moment you stop assuming a hand is steering every hurt toward you, the weight of that hurt gets lighter to carry. Let's slow this scene down, frame by frame, because the speed at which the anger rises and then collapses is the entire point. In the half second before you turn around, your mind has already written an entire story. Someone was careless. Someone wasn't paying attention. Maybe someone did it on purpose, just to ruin your peaceful morning on the water. None of this has been confirmed yet. You haven't even turned your head, and yet the fury is already there, fully formed, ready to be aimed at whoever's sitting in that other boat. This is worth noticing, honestly, because it happens constantly, in situations far less peaceful than a quiet lake at dawn. Someone cuts you off in traffic, and within a second you've decided they're selfish, reckless, personally disrespecting you. A colleague doesn't respond to your message for a few hours, and you've already built a theory about how they're avoiding you, how they don't value your time. A friend cancels plans, and your mind, faster than you can even notice it happening, constructs an entire narrative about being unimportant to them. In every one of these moments, we've turned around, furious, ready to confront the boat, before we've even confirmed there's a hand on the oars. Now here's where the story does something genuinely useful, instead of just clever. You turn around, the boat is empty, and the anger, which felt so solid, so justified, so completely real just a moment ago, has nowhere left to go. It doesn't slowly fade. It simply stops, almost comically fast, because it was never actually about the collision itself. It was about the assumed intention behind the collision. Remove the intention, and the emotional charge collapses on its own, with no effort required. This tells us something important about the nature of most of our anger. It's rarely a pure reaction to what happened. It's almost always a reaction to what we've decided the event means, about how another person feels about us. The traffic itself doesn't make us furious. Being cut off itself doesn't make us furious. It's the story, they don't respect me, they think their time matters more than mine, that generates the heat. Take away that story, and what's left is just a boat, drifting, and a boat, rowing, and two objects that happen to occupy the same space on the water for a moment. Now, this doesn't mean every collision in life really is an empty boat. Sometimes there genuinely is a hand on the oars, someone who acted carelessly, someone who truly did mean harm. The story isn't asking you to pretend malice never exists, or that you should never hold anyone accountable for their actions. What it's asking is something more precise. It's asking you to notice how often you assume the hand is there before you've actually checked. How often you spin around already furious at a person who, when you actually look, isn't even in the boat. Think about how much lighter certain days would feel if this single habit shifted even slightly. The message that went unanswered for hours. What if instead of assuming disrespect, you considered the empty boat? They were simply busy, distracted, dealing with something of their own that had nothing to do with you. The friend who cancelled plans. What if instead of assuming you'd become unimportant to them, you considered the empty boat? Life got complicated for them in a way that had nothing to do with how they feel about you. None of this requires you to become naive or to ignore genuine patterns of disrespect over time. It simply asks you to stop defaulting to the most painful interpretation the instant something uncomfortable happens. There's a deeper layer here too, one that goes beyond how we treat other people and moves into how we treat ourselves. So much of our internal suffering comes from assuming a hand on the oars where there might just be an empty boat drifting on its own current. A wave of sadness rises for no clear reason, and we immediately start hunting for someone or something to blame it on. Our job, our relationship, some failure we can point to as the steering hand behind the feeling. Sometimes there really is a cause worth examining, but sometimes the sadness is simply drifting through, the way weather moves through a sky, with no one steering it toward us at all. Fighting to find someone to blame, even ourselves, can create more suffering than the original feeling ever would have on its own. This is where the practice becomes less about a single dramatic moment on a lake and more about a habit you build slowly, situation by situation. The next time you feel that instant flare of anger or hurt, before the story fully forms, try pausing just long enough to ask one question. Have I actually confirmed there's a hand on the oars? Or am I reacting to a boat I haven't even turned around to look at yet? Sometimes the answer will be yes. There really is intention behind it, and your feelings are valid and worth addressing directly. But you'll be surprised how often, when you actually turn and look, the boat is simply empty, drifting on a current that has nothing to do with you at all. This isn't about becoming someone who never feels anger, someone unnaturally calm, no matter what happens around them. It's about spending your anger where it actually belongs, instead of burning it on assumptions that dissolve the moment you look closely. The lake is still, the morning is quiet, and most of what crashes into us throughout an ordinary day isn't steered by a hand at all. It's simply drifting, the way we ourselves are drifting too, two boats on the same still water, rarely as aimed at each other as our first flash of fury wants us to believe. There's a reason this story is set on still water instead of a crowded, noisy river. Stillness is what makes the collision so jarring in the first place. If the lake were already choppy, already full of other boats bumping into each other constantly, the impact would barely register. It's precisely because the morning was calm, because you expected nothing to interrupt you, that the crash feels so personal, so deserving of a response. This mirrors something true about our daily lives too. The interruptions that upset us most are rarely the biggest ones. They're the ones that catch us in a moment of expected calm. A peaceful morning, disrupted by a sharp text message. A quiet afternoon, interrupted by unexpected criticism. The size of our reaction often has less to do with the size of the event, and more to do with how still the water was the moment before it happened. This is worth remembering the next time you find yourself disproportionately furious about something small. It's rarely really about the size of the collision. It's about the contrast between the stillness you were expecting and the sudden disruption you didn't ask for. Recognizing this doesn't make the frustration disappear, but it does something almost as useful. It gives you a moment of understanding about your own reaction, a chance to notice that some of the intensity belongs to the broken stillness itself, not solely to whatever hit your boat. Now think about how often we go rowing across our own version of that lake, already braced for a collision, already halfway convinced someone is out there steering toward us. If you've had a string of difficult interactions recently, a few genuine collisions with real intention behind them, it's completely natural to start expecting every boat on the water to be aimed at you. This is where the practice becomes even more important, because a mind primed for conflict will often see a hand on the oars, even when the boat is genuinely empty. Healing from real hurt sometimes means relearning how to distinguish between the boats that were truly steered toward you and the ones simply drifting on a current that has nothing to do with you at all. Consider, too, how this story applies to the way we sometimes treat ourselves after we've made a mistake. You forget to reply to an important email, and immediately a harsh internal voice appears, declaring you careless, unreliable, someone who doesn't take things seriously. But was there actually a hand on the oars, some deep character flaw steering that mistake toward existence? Or was it simply a busy week, a full inbox, a human brain doing its imperfect best to keep track of everything demanding its attention? So much of our self-criticism assumes intention where there was really just an empty boat drifting through an ordinary, overloaded day. There's a kind of freedom available once this becomes a genuine habit rather than just an idea you nod along to. Imagine moving through your days with slightly less readiness to assume the worst about every disruption, every delayed reply, every cancelled plan, every sharp word from someone who might simply be having a difficult day of their own that has nothing to do with you. This doesn't mean becoming naive, doesn't mean ignoring real patterns of disrespect when they genuinely exist. It means holding the question open a little longer before deciding, giving yourself the extra second to actually turn around and look before deciding whether there's really a hand behind the oars or simply a current doing what current does. There's one more quiet detail worth returning to before we leave this lake behind. Nobody in this story blames the water itself for carrying the empty boat toward the collision. Nobody shouts at the current. Nobody demands the lake apologize for drifting an object into their path. We instinctively understand that water moves the way water moves, without malice, without agenda, simply following the shape of the ground beneath it. And yet how quickly we forget that people, situations, and entire days often move the same way, shaped by forces and pressures we can't see from where we're sitting, rarely aimed at us specifically, no matter how personal the impact feels in the moment it lands. Carrying this understanding doesn't erase every hurt you'll ever feel. It simply changes what you do with it afterward. Instead of rowing home already furious, already composing the speech you'll give the next time you see whoever was supposedly steering that boat, you might find yourself simply continuing across the lake, a little startled, maybe a little annoyed, but without the extra weight of a grudge built on an assumption that never actually held water in the first place. The two monks and the river. Two monks, one strict about rules, one more relaxed, come to a river where a woman is stranded, unable to cross. The relaxed monk lifts her, carries her across, sets her down, and continues walking. Hours later, the strict monk finally explodes. "We're not supposed to touch women." "How could you do that?" The other monk replies calmly. "I set her down by the river hours ago. Are you still carrying her?" This is the part of the path most people never walk past. They set an event down externally, an argument, a mistake, an insult, but internally, they carry it for hours, days, sometimes years. The body has moved forward on the terrain. The mind is still standing at that riverbank, replaying the crossing over and over. Let's picture the hours between the crossing and the outburst, because that gap is where the entire teaching actually lives. The two monks keep walking. They pass fields, maybe a village, maybe long stretches of quiet road. Nothing more happens at the river. The woman is gone, safely on the other side, likely never thinking about either monk again after that moment. And yet one of them is somewhere else entirely. Not on the road his feet are walking, but back at that riverbank, replaying the same few seconds again and again, building a case, rehearsing an argument, gathering evidence for an explosion that finally arrives hours later, seemingly out of nowhere, to anyone who wasn't inside his head. This should feel uncomfortably familiar to almost everyone watching. Think about the last time someone said something that stung. In a meeting, at a family dinner, in a text message. The moment itself may have lasted 10 seconds, but how many hours did you spend after that, replaying it in the shower, rehearsing what you should have said, building an entire internal courtroom, complete with witnesses and closing arguments, all for an event that the other person may have already completely forgotten by the time you'd finished getting dressed that morning. This is the difference between what actually happened and what we continue doing to ourselves about what happened. The relaxed monk's action at the river took perhaps 2 or 3 minutes total. Lift the woman, cross the river, set her down, keep walking. That's the entire event, fully contained, fully finished. But the strict monk's version of that same event doesn't end at the riverbank. He carries her, metaphorically, for hours, through fields, past villages, into his own exhaustion, until the weight of carrying something that isn't even happening anymore finally forces itself out of him in the form of an accusation. Notice something important here too. The strict monk isn't actually angry about the river crossing itself. Not really. He's angry about the story he's built on top of it, the version where his companion is careless, where rules don't matter, where something wrong has occurred and hasn't yet been addressed. That story required hours of construction, brick by brick, mile by mile, while his companion walked beside him with nothing left to carry at all. This tells us something crucial about the actual mechanics of resentment. It rarely lives in the original event. It lives in the retelling, the internal replaying, the quiet, repetitive construction we do long after the moment itself has ended. An argument with a partner might last 4 minutes, but if you're still narrating it to yourself 3 days later, building your case, imagining better comebacks, deciding what it says about the entire relationship, you're doing exactly what the strict monk did. You're carrying someone who was set down long ago, except now it's not a person, it's a memory, a wound, an old argument that ended everywhere except inside your own mind. There's something worth clarifying here, because this teaching can easily be misunderstood as advice to simply suppress everything, to pretend nothing bothers you, to never process difficult feelings at all. That's not what's being pointed at. The relaxed monk isn't relaxed because he's numb or unfeeling. He's relaxed because he finished the event completely in the moment it happened. He helped the woman. He crossed the river, and whatever feelings arose in that moment, effort, care, maybe even a small flicker of concern about breaking a rule, he processed right there, in real time, instead of postponing that processing for hours down the road. This is the actual skill hidden inside this story, and it's a skill, not a personality trait some people are simply born with, and others aren't. It's the practice of feeling something fully while it's happening, instead of stuffing it down to be unpacked later, badly, in fragments, mixed with exhaustion and imagination and everything else that accumulates during the delay. The strict monk didn't process his discomfort at the river. He suppressed it, kept walking, and let it quietly ferment into something far larger and messier than the original moment ever was. Think about your own patterns here honestly. Are you someone who tends to feel things fully in the moment, say what needs to be said, then genuinely let it go? Or are you someone who tends to smile, nod, keep walking, and then replay the moment for hours or days afterward, building a case you never actually present to the person it's about? Most of us are some mixture of both, depending on the situation, depending on how safe we feel expressing something honestly in real time. But it's worth noticing which pattern you default to, because that pattern determines how much unnecessary weight you end up carrying through your own days. There's a practical version of this worth trying the next time something stings. Instead of swallowing the reaction and walking on in silence, only to have it resurface hours later in a completely different form, try addressing it, even briefly, even imperfectly, close to the moment it happens. This doesn't mean exploding immediately or confronting every small irritation the second it occurs. It means giving yourself permission to actually feel and, where appropriate, express what's arising, instead of performing calm on the outside while a slow fire builds underneath. And for the moments where confronting something in real time genuinely isn't possible, there's still a version of this practice available to you internally. Before you carry something for the rest of the day, ask yourself directly, is this still actually happening, or am I the only one still standing at this riverbank? Often, simply asking the question breaks the spell. The event has ended. The other person has moved on, sometimes without even realizing anything happened at all. The only person still carrying the weight is you, mile after mile, long after the crossing that caused it has become nothing more than a memory everyone else has already set down. This is, in the end, an invitation toward a kind of lightness that has nothing to do with not caring and everything to do with finishing what you start. Feel the river crossing fully, then keep walking, empty-handed, ready for whatever the rest of the path has waiting for you next. There's a physical honesty in this story that's easy to miss on a first read. Carrying an actual person across a river takes real effort, real strength, a real moment of physical exertion that ends the instant she's set down on the other bank. The body knows how to complete an action. Muscles that work to lift and carry immediately relax the moment the weight is gone. There's no ambiguity in the body about when a task has ended. The mind, unfortunately, doesn't come with the same built-in mechanism. It can keep contracting around an old weight indefinitely, flexing the same mental muscles around a memory that has no actual weight left to justify the strain. This mismatch between body and mind is worth sitting with, because it explains why so much of our exhaustion isn't physical at all. You can sleep a full 8 hours and still wake up tired, not because your body didn't rest, but because your mind spent the night quietly rehearsing an old argument, still carrying a woman who was set down on the riverbank days ago. The tiredness isn't coming from anything happening now. It's coming from a phantom weight, held in place purely by repetition, by the mind's stubborn refusal to notice the crossing already ended. Think about how this shows up in the stories we tell about ourselves over long stretches of time, not just single arguments, but entire chapters. Someone who was betrayed years ago might still narrate their present relationships through the lens of that old riverbank, still braced for a repeat crossing that isn't actually happening again. Someone who failed at something significant in their 20s might still carry that failure into decisions made decades later, treating an old setback as though it's still an active event instead of something that ended long ago on a road they've long since walked past. The strict monk's outburst, hours after the crossing, is almost a small mercy in disguise, because at least it finally gets the weight out into the open where it can be examined and released. Most of us don't even get that release. We carry the weight silently for years, never voicing it, never letting it surface long enough to be recognized for what it actually is. An old event, long finished, still being replayed out of habit rather than necessity. The explosion in the story, uncomfortable as it looks, is actually the beginning of relief, not the depth of the problem. This offers something practical worth trying in your own life. If you notice a persistent heaviness around a particular memory, a particular relationship, a particular moment that keeps resurfacing uninvited, it can help to ask the same question the relaxed monk asked his companion. Am I still carrying this? And if so, why? Sometimes, simply naming it out loud, even to yourself, breaks enough of the spell that the weight finally has permission to be set down. Other times, it requires actually speaking to the person involved, finishing a conversation that got interrupted before it ever really ended. Either way, the goal is the same as it was at that riverbank centuries ago. Complete the crossing, set the weight down, keep walking with open hands instead of tired arms still wrapped around something that finished happening a long time ago. There's a quiet kind of freedom promised at the end of this story, one that has nothing to do with never feeling anything difficult again, and everything to do with not needing to hold on to what's already over. The relaxed monk isn't relaxed because nothing ever touches him. He's relaxed because he lets things finish. That's the whole practice. Walked out over a lifetime, one riverbank at a time, one moment fully felt and then fully released, so that the road ahead can be walked with hands finally free enough to carry whatever comes next. The bell with no sound. A student was told to sit and listen for the sound of a bell that hadn't been rung. Confused, frustrated, he sat for hours hearing nothing. Just as he was about to give up, he suddenly understood. The silence itself was the sound he was supposed to be listening to, not the absence of an answer, the answer disguised as absence. We're so trained to chase the next signal, the next notification, the next piece of information, that we've forgotten silence isn't empty. It's actually saying something if we're patient enough to sit inside it, instead of reaching for a way to fill it. Let's sit inside that room with him for a moment, because the discomfort he feels in the first hour is worth naming honestly. He was given an instruction that sounds, on the surface, almost cruel. Listen for a bell that isn't going to ring. Any reasonable person would feel a flicker of frustration at this, maybe even suspicion that the teacher is playing some kind of trick, wasting his time, testing his patience for no real reason. So he sits there, straining his ears, waiting for a sound that never comes, and the longer nothing happens, the more agitated he becomes. This agitation isn't separate from the lesson. It is the lesson, arriving early, before he's ready to recognize it. Think about how rarely we're actually asked to wait for nothing in modern life. Every space we occupy is engineered to be filled. The moment there's a gap in conversation, someone reaches for their phone. The moment a commute goes quiet, a podcast fills it. The moment a task finishes, Another one is already queued up, waiting to take its place, before the last one has even finished settling. We've built entire lives, entire routines, entire identities around the assumption that silence is a problem to be solved, rather than a state worth entering on its own terms. This is why the instruction to listen for an unrung bell feels so strange to us. It asks us to do the one thing we've spent years training ourselves never to do: simply be present with nothing happening, without turning that nothing into a problem that needs immediate fixing. The student's frustration in those early hours is really just withdrawal, the same kind of restlessness anyone feels when a habit they've leaned on for years is suddenly unavailable. Just like the man chasing his shadow, he's discovering how much of his energy has always gone toward escaping stillness rather than simply occupying it. Now here's where the story turns, quietly, without any dramatic event marking the shift. Nothing happens. No bell rings. No teacher walks in with an explanation. The turning point isn't external at all. It happens entirely inside him, in the moment he stops fighting the silence and starts actually listening to it. The way you might stop straining to hear a faraway sound, and instead let your ears simply rest, open, receptive, without effort. In that shift, something changes. The silence stops feeling like an absence and starts feeling like a presence in its own right, full of its own texture, its own quality, its own quiet fullness that was there the entire time, waiting to be noticed instead of overridden. This distinction matters enormously because most of us have never actually experienced silence this way. We've experienced the silence of waiting for something else to happen, which is really just tension dressed up as stillness. But there's another kind of silence entirely, the kind that isn't waiting for anything, that isn't the gap before the next event, but is itself the entire event. This is much harder to describe than to experience, which is exactly why the teacher didn't try to explain it with words. He set up a situation where the student would have no choice but to stumble into it himself. The same way the tea had to spill onto the monk's hands before the lesson about the full cup could actually land. Think about the last time you experienced even a brief flicker of this kind of silence. Maybe it was early in the morning, before anyone else in the house was awake. A stretch of quiet that wasn't leading anywhere, that wasn't the pause before something else began. Maybe it was standing outside on a very still night. No wind, no traffic, nothing demanding your attention. In these moments, if you stayed with them even briefly, instead of immediately reaching for your phone to fill the gap, you may have noticed something faintly similar to what the student discovered on that bench. A kind of fullness where you expected emptiness, a presence where you expected nothing at all. This is worth applying more deliberately, because most of us never get an unrung bell placed in front of us on purpose. We have to build the conditions for it ourselves, in the middle of days that are constantly conspiring to keep every gap filled. This might look like sitting for 5 minutes without any device nearby, not meditating in any formal sense, just sitting, letting whatever arises simply arise, without immediately labeling it boring, or wasted, or unproductive. It might look like eating a meal without a screen in front of you, letting the quiet of chewing and tasting be the whole experience, instead of background noise to something else. What you'll likely notice, especially in the first several attempts, is something close to what the student felt in those early frustrated hours. A restlessness, an urge to check something, fix something, fill something. This is completely normal, and doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It means you're finally feeling the size of the habit you've built around avoiding silence, a habit so consistent it's become nearly invisible until you try to interrupt it even briefly. But if you stay with it, even imperfectly, even for a few minutes at a time, something begins to shift, the same shift the student experienced on that bench. The silence stops feeling like a problem and starts feeling like information, a kind of quiet feedback about what's actually happening underneath all the noise you normally use to avoid noticing it. Sometimes that information is simply peace, uncomplicated and easy. Other times it's something less comfortable, a feeling you've been outrunning that finally has room to surface now that the usual distractions have been cleared away. This is the deeper reason silence matters so much on this path we've been walking together tonight. Every story we've explored so far has pointed, in one way or another, toward the same underlying skill, the ability to stop, to stand still, to let something simply be what it is, without immediately rushing to interpret it, escape it, or fill it with noise. The unrung bell is perhaps the clearest version of this teaching, because it removes every other distraction and leaves you with nothing but the choice itself. Fight the silence, or finally let it speak. There's something else worth noticing about this story, something easy to miss on a first pass. The teacher never tells the student what he's supposed to hear. He doesn't say, listen for peace, or listen for your own breathing, or listen for the answer to some specific question troubling you. He simply says, listen for a bell that hasn't been rung. This vagueness isn't an oversight, it's the entire method. Any more specific instruction would have given the student's mind something to search for, some target to chase, which would have defeated the purpose entirely. The moment you're told exactly what to listen for, you stop truly listening and start hunting instead, scanning for a specific signal the way you'd scan a crowd for a familiar face. Real silence, the kind this story is pointing toward, can only be met with an open, undirected kind of attention, the sort that isn't waiting for anything in particular to appear. This is worth applying honestly to your own life, because most of us, even when we do manage to carve out a few minutes of quiet, spend them hunting rather than listening. We sit down to meditate, and within seconds we're searching for the feeling of calm we read about in some article, checking in every few breaths to see if it's arrived yet, growing frustrated when it doesn't show up on schedule. This is still chasing, just dressed in stillness instead of motion. It's the same restless energy the man chasing his shadow carried down that road, simply relocated to a cushion instead of a pair of running feet. True listening, the kind the student eventually discovered on that bench, has no target. It isn't waiting for calm to arrive. It's willing to sit inside whatever is actually there, calm or otherwise, without turning the sitting itself into another kind of chase. Consider, too, how differently we treat silence depending on who we're with. Sit in silence with a stranger on a train, and it feels awkward, almost unbearable, something to be filled with small talk as quickly as possible. Sit in silence with someone you've known for decades, someone you trust completely, and the same silence can feel warm, comfortable, even intimate. The silence itself hasn't changed. What changed is your relationship to it, your willingness to simply be present inside it, without needing to fix or fill it. This tells us something important. Silence was never actually the problem. Our discomfort with our own unfiltered company was always the real obstacle, standing between us and the kind of stillness this student eventually found on that bench. This is why the unrung bell is such a precise metaphor for something much larger than a single afternoon spent in a quiet room. It represents every moment in life when we're asked to simply be present with what is, without a clear signal telling us what to do next, without a notification confirming we're on the right track, without any external validation that this moment matters or is being spent correctly. Most of us have grown so dependent on these signals that their absence feels like failure, like something has gone wrong, like we're missing something we're supposed to be hearing. The truth this story offers is gentler and far more available than we assume. Nothing has gone wrong. The bell was never going to ring. The absence itself was the entire message, waiting patiently for us to stop demanding it sound like something else before we were willing to call it an answer. Think about how you might build even a small version of this practice into an ordinary week, not as a dramatic retreat into silence, but as small, repeated moments of choosing not to fill a gap the instant it appears. The elevator ride where you'd normally check your phone. The few minutes before a meeting starts where you'd normally scroll through something to pass the time. The walk to your car where music or a podcast would normally fill every step. None of these moments require hours of stillness. They require only a willingness to let a small gap remain a gap, unfilled, unexplained, simply present, the same way the student eventually let the silence in that room remain silence, instead of forcing it into something it was never going to become. The two wolves. An old teacher tells a child there are two wolves fighting inside every person. One is fear, greed, and resentment. The other is patience, honesty, and calm. The child asks which one wins. The old teacher says simply, whichever one you feed. This story gets repeated so often, it risks losing its weight. So let's actually sit with it, instead of nodding past it. Feeding isn't a big dramatic choice you make once. It's the show you replay in your head before bed. It's the group chat you keep checking that always leaves you irritated. It's the version of the story you tell yourself about why someone hurt you. Every small choice, all day, every day, is a spoonful going into one bowl or the other. Let's start by noticing something the story doesn't spend much time on, but that matters enormously. Both wolves are real. Both are actually present, actually alive inside the child, inside every person listening to this teaching. The old teacher isn't describing a battle between something real and something imaginary. He's describing two genuine capacities that exist simultaneously in every human being. The capacity for fear and the capacity for calm. The capacity for resentment and the capacity for patience. Neither one is a flaw to be surgically removed. Both are part of what it means to be a person walking through an uncertain world. This matters because so many people, hearing this story, walk away with the idea that the goal is to somehow eliminate the darker wolf entirely. To become a person who never feels fear, never feels resentment, never feels the pull of something less noble. That's not what the story is teaching, and chasing that goal usually backfires badly, creating a kind of internal war, where the very act of suppressing the darker wolf ends up feeding it more energy than ignoring it ever would have. What the story is actually pointing toward is something more honest and more workable. Both wolves exist. The question was never which one you can destroy. The question is which one you're going to spend your limited energy strengthening today. Think about what feeding actually looks like in granular, ordinary detail, because this is where the teaching either becomes useful or stays a nice story you nod along to without changing anything. Feeding the fearful wolf doesn't require some dramatic act of cruelty toward yourself or others. It happens in the small, repeated choices that feel almost too minor to matter. Replaying an embarrassing moment from years ago instead of letting it fade. Checking a message thread that reliably leaves you feeling worse, again and again, out of habit rather than any real need. Constructing, in your own head, the worst possible interpretation of someone's silence, someone's tone, someone's delay in responding. None of these choices feel significant in isolation, but repeated daily, for months, for years, they build an animal with real teeth, real hunger, real influence over how you move through the world. The same is true in the opposite direction for the second wolf. Feeding patience doesn't require some grand act of virtue either. It happens in choices just as small as the ones that feed fear. Pausing half a second longer before responding to something that stung. Choosing, deliberately, to interpret an ambiguous silence generously instead of assuming the worst. Letting a small irritation pass without building an entire narrative around it. None of these choices feel like much in the moment, but repeated daily, they build a different kind of animal entirely. One with a completely different relationship to the world. Calmer, steadier, less reactive to every small disturbance that crosses its path. This reframes the whole question of self-improvement in a useful way. Most people approach change as if it requires some enormous act of willpower, a complete personality overhaul achieved through sheer force. But this story suggests something gentler and, in a strange way, more achievable. You don't need to defeat the fearful wolf in some dramatic confrontation. You simply need to notice, moment by moment, which bowl your attention is currently leaning toward, and gently, without self-judgment, choose to place the next spoonful in the other one instead. Consider your own evenings for a moment, since that's often when the fearful wolf gets fed most generously. In the quiet hour before sleep, when the mind, no longer distracted by the day's tasks, starts replaying old conversations, old worries, old what-ifs. This is prime feeding time for the wolf, built from fear and resentment, precisely because there's nothing else competing for your attention. Simply noticing this pattern, without harshness, is itself a form of feeding the other wolf. Even the act of catching yourself mid-spiral and choosing, deliberately, to think about something steadier instead, is a spoonful placed in the calmer bowl. There's also something worth naming about how this story handles the relationship between the two wolves over time. The teacher doesn't say the fearful wolf disappears once you start feeding the calmer one consistently. He simply says the fed wolf grows stronger. This distinction matters because it means you're not aiming for some permanent victory where fear and resentment never visit you again. You're aiming for a shifting balance, a wolf grown strong enough through consistent feeding that it no longer gets overpowered every time the other one shows up hungry. Fear will still visit. Resentment will still knock, but a well-fed patience, built through months and years of small, consistent choices, is far better equipped to hold its ground when that knock comes. This is, in the end, one of the most practical teachings we'll walk through tonight, precisely because it doesn't ask for anything dramatic. It simply asks you to notice, throughout an ordinary day, which bowl you're leaning toward with each small choice, each thought you choose to entertain or release, each story you choose to keep telling yourself about the people and events around you. Small spoonfuls, repeated daily, are how either animal grows strong. The choice, quiet and unglamorous as it is, was always sitting right there in your hands. There's a reason this story is told to a child rather than an adult, and it's worth thinking about why. Children haven't yet built the elaborate justifications adults use to explain away their feeding habits. An adult who spends an hour scrolling through arguments online, feeling their blood pressure rise with every post, will usually have a ready explanation for why this is necessary, staying informed, understanding the other side, preparing themselves for the next confrontation. A child, hearing the same story, doesn't need any of that justification stripped away first, because it was never built in the first place. This is partly why the story lands so cleanly, so simply. It bypasses the layers of rationalization most of us have spent years constructing around our own feeding habits. This is worth being honest about in your own life, because the fearful wolf rarely gets fed through choices that feel obviously wrong in the moment. It gets fed through choices that feel justified, reasonable, even responsible. Staying up late worrying about a decision feels like diligence. Replaying a conflict feels like preparing yourself to handle it better next time. Assuming the worst about someone's intentions feels like protecting yourself from being caught off guard again. None of these choices announce themselves as feeding the darker wolf. They dress themselves up as caution, as thoroughness, as self-protection. This is exactly what makes them so effective at strengthening fear and resentment over time, because we rarely notice we're doing it, let alone question whether it's actually serving us. Consider, by contrast, how modest and unremarkable feeding the calmer wolf tends to look from the outside. Nobody applauds you for choosing not to reply to a provocative comment. Nobody notices when you let a small irritation pass without turning it into a grievance you'll bring up again in 3 weeks. Nobody sees the moment you choose to interpret someone's short reply as busyness rather than dismissal. This is part of why the calmer wolf so often loses out in the daily competition for our attention. Its feedings are quiet, invisible, unrewarded by the world around us, while the fearful wolf's feedings often come dressed in the appealing costume of vigilance, preparation, or justified anger. This asymmetry means feeding the calmer wolf consistently requires a kind of deliberate attention that feeding the fearful one never does. Fear feeds itself automatically, given the slightest opening, because it's louder, faster, and more evolutionarily rewarded than patience ever was. Calm has to be chosen, again and again, often without any external recognition that you're choosing it at all. This is not a reason to give up on the practice. It's simply useful to understand going in, so that when the feeding of calm feels harder, slower, less immediately satisfying than the alternative, you're not surprised. That difficulty isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's simply the nature of the two animals being described, one loud and hungry by default, the other quiet and requiring your conscious care to grow strong. Think about a specific moment from your own recent past. Something small, an irritation at a family member, a flash of jealousy toward a friend's success, a wave of anxiety about something still unresolved. Notice which wolf you fed in that moment, honestly, without judgment. Maybe you fed the fearful one without even realizing it, replaying the irritation for the rest of the afternoon, letting the jealousy curdle into something closer to resentment, letting the anxiety spiral into worst-case scenarios that never actually happened. This isn't a failure. It's simply useful information, a chance to notice the pattern clearly enough that next time, in a similarly small moment, you might catch yourself before the spoon reaches the wrong bowl. The old teacher never promises the child that feeding the calmer wolf will be easy or immediately rewarding. He simply states a fact, plainly, without embellishment. Whichever one you feed, there's no trick here, no shortcut, no single dramatic act that settles the matter permanently. There's only the accumulation of small choices, repeated across years, quietly determining which animal eventually grows strong enough to meet whatever the world brings next. There's one more layer worth sitting with before we leave these two wolves behind, and it has to do with how they behave around each other over time. A wolf fed consistently doesn't simply grow larger in isolation. It grows more confident, more present, more willing to step forward the instant it's needed. The way a muscle trained regularly responds faster and more reliably than one left dormant for years. This means the benefit of feeding patience isn't only felt in calm, uneventful stretches of life. It's felt most clearly in the moments that matter most, the sudden bad news, the unexpected conflict, the moment someone says something that would have once sent you spiraling for days. A well-fed calmer wolf doesn't disappear during these moments. It steps forward, trained, ready, familiar with exactly this kind of terrain. because it's been walked through smaller versions of it 1,000 times before, in the quiet, unremarkable choices of ordinary days. This is why the small, invisible feedings matter so much more than they seem to in the moment. You're not simply managing your mood today. You're training which animal shows up first the next time something genuinely difficult happens. The next time you actually need patience instead of panic, calm instead of resentment. The child in this story doesn't need to understand every layer of this training process. He only needs the simple truth handed to him plainly. Whichever one you feed, the rest, the years of small choices that follow, is something every one of us gets to practice for ourselves, one spoonful, one ordinary moment at a time. The path with no map. A young traveler once asked an old wanderer for directions to enlightenment. The wanderer said, "I can't give you the map, because the terrain changes depending on who's walking it. But I can tell you this, stop looking so hard for the destination that you miss what's happening under your own 2 feet right now." This is the layer almost everyone resists, because it offers no 5-step plan, no checklist, no shortcut. Just this instruction: walk the path you're actually on, not the one you wish you were on, not the one someone else is walking. The terrain under your own feet, right now, today, is the only one that was ever real. Let's sit with the young traveler's disappointment for a moment, because it's completely understandable and worth honoring before we move past it. He came looking for something concrete, a set of directions, a series of landmarks to watch for, a way to measure his progress against a fixed and reliable standard. This is a deeply human request. We want maps, because maps offer certainty, and certainty feels safer than the alternative, walking forward without any guarantee that we're headed the right way. When the wanderer refuses to hand over a map, it can feel less like wisdom and more like abandonment, as if he's simply withholding something the traveler genuinely needs. But look closer at the reason given. The terrain changes depending on who's walking it. This isn't a vague spiritual platitude. It's a precise and practical observation about the nature of any meaningful path. 2 people walking toward the same general destination, whether that destination is peace, purpose, or simply a life that feels honestly lived, will encounter completely different terrain along the way, because they're carrying different histories, different wounds, different strengths, different starting points. A map drawn for one traveler's mountain will almost certainly mislead the next traveler who tries to follow it exactly. The same way the backpack full of old maps misled the man at the base of the unfamiliar mountain earlier in this journey we've been walking together. Think about how much of the self-improvement world is built around ignoring this exact truth. 5-step programs promising the same results for everyone who follows them precisely. Morning routines presented as universal keys to a better life, regardless of what someone's actual days, actual responsibilities, actual nervous system can realistically hold. There's nothing wrong with learning from other people's paths, borrowing insight, gathering tools along the way. But there's a difference between borrowing a tool and mistaking someone else's exact map for your own unique terrain. The traveler wanted the second thing. The wanderer offered him the first, a piece of wisdom rather than a fixed set of directions. Notice, too, what the wanderer redirects him toward instead of a map. Not nothing, not an empty shrug of uncertainty. He redirects him toward his own 2 feet, toward the ground he's actually standing on, right now, today, in this exact moment. This is a subtle but enormous shift in focus. Most of us spend enormous amounts of energy looking toward the horizon, toward some future version of ourselves who has finally arrived, finally figured it out, finally reached the destination we imagine waiting for us somewhere further down the path. In doing so, We walk right past the actual ground beneath our feet, without ever really feeling it, without ever really noticing what's happening in the only moment we ever actually have access to. This connects directly back to the farmer who refused to declare his story finished too early, and to the two monks who understood the importance of finishing an event completely instead of carrying it forward unnecessarily. Each of these stories, in their own way, points toward the same underlying truth. The present moment, the one right under your feet, is the only terrain that has ever been real. Everything else, the destination you're chasing, the map you wish someone would hand you, the finished story you're trying to force onto an event that hasn't finished happening yet, is a kind of walking without actually touching the ground. Consider how this shows up in your own relationship with progress. Maybe you're waiting to feel calm once a certain goal is achieved, once a certain relationship reaches a certain stage, once a certain number appears in a bank account or on a scale. In each case, you've quietly convinced yourself that peace lives at the destination rather than in the walking itself. But destinations, once reached, have a strange habit of not delivering what we expected. The goal gets achieved, and almost immediately, a new horizon appears, a new destination to chase, because the habit of looking forward, instead of down, was never actually about the specific destination in the first place. It was about the orientation itself, always ahead, never here. The wanderer's advice, simple as it sounds, is actually asking for something quite difficult. Stop looking so hard for the destination that you miss what's happening under your own 2 feet right now. This requires a kind of trust that most of us haven't been taught to have. Trust that the present moment, unglamorous and ordinary as it often feels, actually contains everything you're looking for, if you're willing to actually look at it, instead of constantly scanning the horizon for something better waiting further ahead. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years walking toward a destination that keeps redrawing itself the moment you get close. You wanted a certain job, and once you had it, the goalpost quietly moved to a promotion within that job. You wanted a certain relationship, and once you had it, the goalpost moved to some deeper, more permanent version of closeness that always seemed to sit just out of reach. This isn't a personal failing. It's what happens when peace gets treated as a location instead of a way of walking. Locations, by their nature, keep moving further away the moment you define your worth by reaching them, because there's always a next location waiting once you arrive, and the habit of looking ahead instead of down was never actually satisfied by any single arrival in the first place. Think about what it would mean to genuinely trust the wanderer's redirection, to actually turn your attention toward your own 2 feet instead of the horizon, even for a single ordinary hour of your day. This doesn't mean abandoning goals or ambition entirely. It means holding them differently, as something you're walking toward, rather than something you're only allowed to feel settled once you've grabbed hold of. A goal held this way still gets pursued with just as much effort and care. But the walking itself stops being treated as a punishment you have to endure until the reward finally arrives. The walking becomes the actual substance of your life, not merely the corridor you're rushing through to reach some better room further down the hall. Consider how differently a single ordinary Tuesday might feel under this kind of attention. Instead of treating the meetings, the errands, the conversations, the quiet moments between tasks as simply obstacles standing between you and the evening when your real life supposedly begins, you might actually notice them as they happen. The taste of your coffee, the particular quality of light coming through a window at that specific hour, the sound of a colleague's voice as they explain something you already understand. None of this requires you to abandon your responsibilities or float through the day in some detached haze. It simply requires you to actually be present for the day you're already living, instead of mentally living somewhere further down a path you haven't reached yet. This is, in many ways, the thread tying every story we've walked through tonight together. The traveler with the outdated maps needed to look at the actual mountain in front of him, instead of the paper in his hands. The man chasing his shadow needed to stop and stand still in the shade, instead of continuing to run towards some imagined safety further down the road. The farmer needed to stay present with an unfinished story, instead of rushing to declare its ending. The two monks needed to either fully feel and release a moment, or fully finish carrying it, rather than remaining halfway between the riverbank and the road ahead. The student needed to stop hunting for a specific sound and simply be present with the silence actually filling the room. Every single one of these teachings, told through completely different images, different characters, different settings, is ultimately pointing toward the exact same ground the wanderer redirects the traveler toward at the very end. Not some distant destination, the very spot where your feet are already standing. This is worth carrying with you long after this particular story fades from memory. The next time you catch yourself straining toward some future moment when things will finally feel settled, when the next achievement or relationship or circumstance will finally deliver the peace you've been chasing, try pausing just long enough to notice the ground beneath you right now, exactly as it is, unfinished, imperfect, ordinary. That ground was never a waiting room. It was always the destination itself, disguised as something you had to pass through on your way to somewhere else. Here it is, the single insight underneath every story we just walked through. You were never actually looking for peace out there, on some future terrain, some better job, some healed relationship, some version of yourself that finally has it all figured out. You were looking for permission to stop running from the ground you're already standing on. That's it. That's the quiet thunder. Not a discovery, a permission slip you were always allowed to write yourself. So think back to that overflowing cup at the very beginning. Maybe you didn't need someone to hand you more wisdom, more advice, more strategies for a calmer mind. Maybe you just needed to set the cup down for a second and notice it was already full of everything you needed. The shadow you were running from, the empty boat that hit you, the bell that never rang. Every single one of these stories was quietly saying the same thing from a different angle. Stop searching the horizon for a peace that's already sitting exactly where you are. You don't need a new mountain to climb. You need to stop running from your own footsteps on the one you're already climbing. If this found you at the right moment tonight, subscribe, because there are 19 more stops on this path waiting for you.